Now to Behind the Wall with Stan Grant and the deteriorating relationship between Australia and China. And Stan, to quote China, if you make China the enemy, China will be the enemy. Is that a declaration of diplomatic war?
Well, this is where we've been heading, Bev. I mean, if you look at our relationship right now, it is not wrong to call this Cold War 2.0. In fact, you could make an argument that the Cold War never ended in China. Of course, when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Empire came to an end later in 1991, China remained the single biggest communist power in the world. And that tension has remained, even though China has opened up to the world and built its economic and financial links with other parts of the world. And of course, we have a very deep trade relationship. When it comes to politics, when it comes to what China sees as its own sphere of influence, it has been very protective. It has pushed back against criticism, and we've seen this ratcheting up in recent times. This has something to do with Xi Jinping and the way Xi Jinping sees the world. He believes that China has a rightful place at the apex of global power. He is increasing China's influence throughout the world. It also goes to something deeply etched in the Chinese psyche, Bev, and that is this idea of the 100 years of humiliation that the Chinese will not take being pushed around by foreign powers. They had enough of that from the Opium War in the mid-1840s, 1850s, right through to the Japanese occupation in the 1930s and 40s. So when Australia criticises China, when it raises criticism about things like the detention of Uyghurs or the crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong, when it questions the coronavirus, handling of coronavirus and calls for an inquiry, that touches really red-hot buttons inside China. I think another thing to look at is the Australia-Japan military alliance we've seen announced this week. Don't forget that Japan, in the eyes of so many in China, remains an implacable enemy. They may have better diplomatic ties and a close trade relationship, but the wounds there run deep as well. So it is not difficult to understand why we are seeing this pushback right now and how much more complicated it makes for us to manage this critical relationship.
But Stan, why has Australia been singled out for such anger, such ridicule? We're certainly not seeing Scott Morrison take a backward step, but it's become a very difficult relationship and situation to try and rescue.
That is a fantastic question, Bev, and it goes something to do with our proximity in the world. We are in Asia, and of course China sees itself as the preponderant power of Asia. If you look at the view from Beijing, Beijing says, look, we're the biggest engine of economic growth in the world. By the end of this decade, we are likely to overtake the United States as the single biggest economic power in the world. It is our economic strength that helped to drag Australia through the worst of the global financial crisis that gave Australia 30 years of uninterrupted economic growth. So that's how China sees the Australia relationship now. Australia's close strategic ties, its alliance with the United States, puts it very much at this hinge point of history, Bev, the rising China, and perhaps we can see a waning American power in the world, and we are right there. We are right at that hinge point. A lot of the world is looking at us, in fact, and saying, how does Australia manage this? Because Australia is clearly going to come in for extra criticism because of where we are geographically and because of our trade ties. How does Australia manage this? Is Australia able to effectively balance its strategic interests with the US and its trade interests with China? We are, in many respects, Bev, the canary in the coal mine. And if you think that this week, of course, also marked 1 year since the first outbreak of coronavirus in Wuhan, I think coronavirus has accelerated. It has revealed a lot of the fault lines in the world, but it has also accelerated them. A virus that came out of China has significantly weakened the United States, and this also plays into it, with Australia's criticism of China and, of course, calling for that inquiry into the outbreak of coronavirus. We want to have a look back now at this past year, how coronavirus broke out, the impact it had, and how China has handled it.
China has identified the cause of the mysterious pneumonia outbreak in Wuhan city, and it's from the same family that caused the deadly SARS epidemic 17 years ago.
The government's bombshell in the early hours of the morning presented people with an impossible choice. Stay in the city for who knows how long in the midst of an escalating epidemic, or try to get out quick smart.
giving us an idea. The city's empty, man. Like, the population's 11 million people. I can only see maybe 1 or 2 people on the street.
A city under quarantine with no idea how long it'll be cut off from the world.
In Wuhan, an extraordinary project is taking shape to build 2 hospitals with hundreds of beds within weeks.
Officials in the city of Wuhan, where the global pandemic began, yesterday reported an increase of 50% in coronavirus fatalities, taking the death count to 3,869.
Yesterday, Wuhan reported no new cases for the first time since the outbreak started.
Today, the most affected province in China from the coronavirus, Hubei, is going to ease travel restrictions.
As the clock struck midnight, the gates to the city opened. After 76 days, finally something to celebrate.
Wuhan provides hope for the rest of the world, that even the most severe situation can be turned around.
Professor Dale Fisher is the Chair of Infection Control at the National University of Singapore. He's also the Chair of the World Health Organisation's Outbreak Alert and Response Network. And he joins me now from Singapore. Professor, it's good to have you on the program. You were in China earlier this year. Just tell us what you took away from that trip.
Thanks for having me, Stan. It was there was a couple of weeks build up and looking at the type of things that we might want to find from the mission. And it was a technical mission where we were really trying to learn as much as we could. The Chinese had already had over a month's experience with it. So this was about trying to understand more about the transmission, the severity, how it clustered, who were the vulnerable groups. And I think the mission report from that has stood the test of time, really. The most profound thing that I noticed when I was there, though, was how this virus had brought China to its knees. Beijing, the skies were clear blue. There was nobody on the streets. There were very few cars. And having been to Beijing a few times in the past, it was really extraordinary.
Yeah, well, having lived in Beijing for many years, you don't often see blue skies, so that is remarkable. You were there, of course, during the period when this was at its peak, but it had actually broken out several months before that. Did you look at that initial response? Because there's been a lot of criticism of that initial response from China.
To be honest, it was scoped out. We felt that the best investment in our time was really going to see how the rest of the world could protect itself. So it was really technical about the virus, about the interventions, and getting the message out to the rest of the world that this was a very serious situation. So actually trying to work out how it jumped species or where it came from originally, we felt would be best addressed at another time.
Now, we know, of course, that China was able to crack down once it really did zero in on this, and there was lockdown, and some of the images at the time were quite extraordinary, stark, really, very confronting when you see buildings locked down and people being dragged out of buildings in some cases. Of course, we've seen that then play out in other parts of the world, including Australia.
Exactly. The things that you've always got to be careful before you start criticising any other place, because you're quite right. We thought lockdowns, that's absolutely unacceptable in any other society. But now we see that too often it's the mainstay of interventions, and and people have had to get serious.
It does raise a question, given how successfully China appears to have dealt with this. It raises questions about what type of government, what type of regime is more suited to this sort of emergency. China surely would sit there and say, well, our system of government was able to deal with this perhaps more effectively than, say, a country like the United States. Is that a fair enough assessment?
I think it's a little, perhaps a little simplistic. There's most of East Asia are democracies. They may not be exactly the same as democracies in other parts of the world, and sure there are perhaps cultural differences between populations, but by and large this is all about community engagement, and if you can rally your community with sound scientific decisions, then obviously any country I think is capable of doing it. But whether you do it as a doctrine or whether you do it as an explanation and appealing to people's community or sense of community engagement, then yeah, governments have to do it in different ways for their own populations.
It's interesting you mentioned some of the other Asian countries. You were involved in the response there in Singapore, which had varying degrees of success, but certainly if you compare it to places like the United States or Europe has been able to manage this. But other countries such as Taiwan, Japan, which stayed open, did not go into complete lockdown. What made those countries' response more effective? Was it because they'd had experience with this, they'd learnt the lessons from SARS? Is there a cultural aspect to this as well?
Well, I think there is a cultural aspect in some sense. There's probably a stronger sense of community responsibility over individual rights, if you like. So people would understand that there are things they do for the community's greater good, and it's not about what's right for me and what I want to do. So for instance, masks are mandated in Singapore, but it wouldn't be a problem anyway. You would feel very awkward going out in Singapore without wearing a mask, and you'd probably get people looking at you, probably walking around you, giving you a fair bit of leeway, and you would feel uncomfortable. So yeah, people do develop a sense of community responsibility.
Now, if we look at the criticism of China, and there's been, of course, those calls for an inquiry into the origins of coronavirus in Wuhan, and that coming from Australia, which has created strain in that relationship or contributed to strain in that relationship. From your assessment, was that unnecessary or was that handled poorly?
I recall the events, obviously, and this investigation was always going to happen. When we were in China, we actually, without specifically asking, we were seeing a lot of results of swabs on animals, swabs on the environment, because they were really trying to see if there was a sort of an intermediate species going from bats to humans, and we saw results of thousands of animal tests. So I hear what you're saying, and I agree. I don't think there was a fight that needed to be picked, but maybe Australia didn't realise it was picking a fight. I'm not sure, but this was going to happen anyway, and it's really difficult, scientifically and politically.
Well, now, of course, this week marks a year since that first outbreak in Wuhan. We're now apparently on the cusp of having a vaccine. A lot of these trials have been very successful thus far. How much store do you place in that? Can we relax after we get the vaccine, or how long is this going to be with us?
So I think the first thing to understand is that this is only hope. We're not any different today than we were last week. Everything has to keep applying, whatever your national or state strategy is. So I think there's still too many unknowns. We don't really understand, well, we obviously don't understand how long this will last for, and if the effect wanes after 3 or 4 months, then really the vaccine is little use to us. So they've only been going for 2 months now on thousands of patients. So as we get longer periods of time, more patients, we still don't know the effect or the benefits on elderly or on children or on immune suppressed groups, who are all the people that we want to protect. So it's great news, don't get me wrong, and it really is serious light at the end of the tunnel that this way of manufacturing a vaccine seems to be working. It's the best news we could have had, but still I'm very wary of the way the world has been drip-fed information over the last year, and people celebrate and then, oh, it's not so good after all. And that's not fair. People talk about this outbreak fatigue, and that's a good way to wear you down, I think, is get your hopes up and then say, oh, we've got some bad news. So I think we just take it as very hopeful, but we stay true to the course.
Professor, it's been a pleasure to talk to you on the program. Thank you again for giving us your time.
My pleasure, Stan.